welcome to the debate. Today, we are examining one of the most foundational and, I think, misinterpreted figures in Western tradition, the Nahash, the serpent of Genesis chapter 3. For millennia, traditional readings have just identified this figure with Satan or the devil.
And I think we both agree that based on a close, rigorous reading of the original Hebrew, paying careful attention to the grammar, the literary sequence, it becomes pretty clear that this easy equation of the Nahash with some fallen angel, it's just not supported by the text itself. That's our shared starting point.
Exactly. And that consensus forces a much more interesting and, frankly, more difficult question. If the Nahash is not Satan, what is its function? Is Genesis 3 primarily there to establish the foundational legal and moral structure for human accountability, or is it setting up a powerful, sophisticated typological pattern that foreshadows the Messiah?
That really is the crux of it, isn't it? Whether we read Genesis 3 as, say, a court record establishing guilt, or as a theological blueprint establishing a pattern of redemption.
And I argue for the former. I contend that the Nahash exists to establish the structural preconditions for moral culpability. The serpent is defined by its absence of jurisdiction. It sets the stage. But the real drama, the beginning of moral accountability, doesn't kick off until later, with Cain.
And I come at it from a very different angle. I see the Nahash as a living, divinely appointed symbol of wisdom and consequence. One that was consecrated for a redemptive vocation right from the start. A structural pattern that Christ himself fulfills.
Well, let's delve into the accountability side of this, because it relies so heavily on what the text doesn't say and on the sequence of events. The Nahash is never warned by God, it's never giving a command, so it can't really be judged for violating an instruction the way Adam and Eve are. I suggest that Satan isn't a creature in Genesis 3 at all. Instead, this adversarial quality is introduced as a functional predicate. Think of it like a job title, a role, not a person. And this role, the adversary, has to be embodied later by an accountable host. The proof of this is right there in Genesis 3:15. We see the term Eva, which means enmity or an adversarial condition. It's absolutely vital to see that Eva is not a being that the serpent possesses. It's a relational condition introduced between the parties, between the serpent and the woman. God establishes opposition. He doesn't judge a being called Satan.
I do appreciate the linguistic precision on the Eva's predicate, but I'm a little concerned that your argument requires Genesis 3 to be, structurally incomplete until Genesis 4 shows up.
Precisely. That is the point. The narrative sequence is everything. Where does the formal beginning of moral jurisdiction happen? It's in Genesis 4, verse 7. When God gives Cain that instruction about his anger. God warns him, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. This is the first time we see instruction, human agency, and a command to master something. So when Cain fails, commits murder, and then lies about it, he becomes the first judged host of that adversarial role. This reading makes perfect sense of Jesus' description in John 8 of a murderer from the beginning of culpability in Genesis 4, not the beginning of creation. The Nahash is just the catalyst. The real failure, the beginning of sin, is a human failure to rule.
That is a very compelling case for a legal structure, I'll grant you that. And I don't deny that the structure is there. My issue is that it minimizes the profound symbolic and, I would say, cultic weight that Genesis 3 carries. It turns the Nahash into merely a blind structural contrast, and the text presents it as something far more significant. I mean, it's described as a room which is subtle, perceptive, wise. This suggests it's a wisdom agent at the tree of knowledge. Its identity seems tied to ontology, not zoology, which might be why the text is oddly silent about its creation in the Genesis 1 taxonomy.
But if it's a symbol of redemptive wisdom, why does God condemn its physical form to eat dust? I mean, that's a clear sign of mortality and punishment. That seems to contradict the whole idea of it being an elevated agent.
And that is where we have to read the text through a cultic lens. We are misreading the curse as just punishment. When God declares, "Cursed are you above all livestock," the Hebrew phrase is mikol.
Now, while it can mean above all, in this kind of context, it functions to set the Nahash apart, to elevate it from the other animals, specifically the sacrificial ones. Livestock, sheep, goats, oxen, were for sacrifice. To be cursed above them isn't to be demoted, it's to be placed in a unique position that transcends the normal sacrificial system. It's a consecration. It assigns the Nahash this unique redemptive role as the ultimate bearer of consequence.
So you're suggesting the judgment is the consecration?
Absolutely. And this typological pattern, it's not just implied, it's confirmed later. In Numbers 21, when Israel needs healing, what does God tell Moses to lift up? Not a lamb, not a goat, but the Nahash. And where does this all culminate? Well, Jesus explicitly claims this model for his own death in John 3:14. As Moses lifted up the serpent, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. The serpent is the first shadow of the cross. This makes its role central, not just some placeholder for Cain.
I see the power of that typological case, and the connection to John 3 is it's undeniable. However, I have to return to the primary weight of the narrative in Genesis 3 itself. If the Nahash is the first Christological archetype, why is its judgment so focused on making it a sign-bearer of mortality? When God says, "Dust you shall eat," dust in the Old Testament is universally the stuff of human mortality. To dust you shall return. The primary focus seems to be showing the consequence of opposition existing before human culpability gets established with Cain. The serpent is judged as a participant. Yes, it bears the sign of mortality, but it isn't the source of the ethical sin. That is rooted in a human failure to rule when commanded. Your reading elevates the symbol, but I think it sacrifices the legal foundation being laid.
I think you're creating a false choice there, the court versus the temple. The judgment is liturgical symbolism. Dust you shall eat isn't zoology, it's a role assignment to bear human mortality. And this makes the Nahash the perfect type of Christ, the one who became sin for us, who became a curse for us. This ontological assignment as the consequence bearer is fundamentally necessary for the whole redemptive pattern. The consequence bearer has to be in place before the accountable agent fails.
Let's shift then to Genesis 3:15, specifically the identity of the seed, because that really challenges the traditional messianic reading and ties back into your whole typological view.
Exactly. And I'm sorry, I just don't buy the traditional singular reading of the seed there. The seed of the woman refers to collective humanity. Eve herself calls Cain her seed in the very next chapter. The messianic fulfillment is vocational. Christ fulfills the pattern. It's not genetically predetermined. But conversely, Christ fulfills the pattern of the Nahash, the one lifted up, the one bearing the curse. So in a symbolic sense, Christ is the vocational seed of the Nahash. And this is reinforced, if you're open to ancient numerical traditions, by the fact that the gematria, the numerical value of the Hebrew letters for both Nahash and Mashiach, Messiah, equals 358. That suggests a really profound intentional symbolic symmetry.
That numerical correlation is fascinating, I'll admit, but it risks shifting the focus away from the Nahash's primary role in the text, which is establishing conflict. I think whether the seed is collective or singular, the core substantive element of that verse is the conflict, the aiva, and this whole bruising logic. My focus remains on that structural adversarial tension. Let's look at the bruising. The woman's seed, humanity, the heel, bruises the Nahash's head. This is fulfilled at Golgotha, the place of the skull, where Christ is bruised but defeats that opposition structure.
But what about the other side of that? How does the Nahash bruise the heel?
Well, the Nahash, or the adversarial consequence it carries, bruises humanity's heel. It destabilizes human dominion, our foundation. We see this instability all through the narrative, right up into Daniel 2, where earthly kingdoms are represented by feet and heels being crushed. So this confirms that the Nahash is defined primarily by its role in initiating this universal, necessary relationship of adversarial tension. It's not about its personal holiness or lack thereof.
But you're arguing it's just a vehicle for this conflict? I'm arguing it's a willing, active agent in a divine structure.
Okay, let's go deeper into the grammar of that conflict, because that's where the accountability argument is sharpest. I maintain that Eva, the enmity, is the predicate that later gets personalized by its role, Hasatan, the adversary.
The grammatical placement of Eva, placed between the parties, is decisive. It prevents any reading where the Nahash is Satan. If you try to argue that, you'd logically have God placing Satan between Satan and the woman. It's a textual absurdity.
The structure demands that separation.
The grammatical reading of the predicate is sound. I'll concede that the text doesn't allow us to call the Nahash Satan, but where your interpretation, I think, minimizes the serpent is in defining it as just a consequence and not a moral agent.
But if it wasn't a blind participant, why wasn't it judged as an accountable agent? Because its role was higher than mere accountability. Look at the text again. The Nahash speaks truthfully. Its claims that their eyes would be opened, that they would know good and evil, are explicitly affirmed by God himself in Genesis 3:22. Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. The serpent functions as an agent of divine wisdom. That Arum, who initiates the tension between two divine commands, be fruitful and multiply versus you shall surely die, it's the one that initiates the path toward consequence. The ultimate proof is that the typology, confirmed by John 3:14, insists that the Nahash retains a positive, redemptive identity despite bearing the adversarial condition of mortality, the dust.
The logical purity of that predicate argument for me maintains the priority. Moral accountability is held by the human agent, Cain. The Nahash initiates, but humanity is the one that takes possession of the role.
And for me, the narrative necessity of Christ modeling his crucifixion on a redemptive symbol necessitates the Nahash's primordial elevation. It has to be the first archetype, regardless of the legal structure that follows.
So we've explored two distinct, yet I think equally rigorous ways of interpreting the identity and function of the serpent in Genesis 3. And it fundamentally shifts how we understand the purpose of that entire chapter. My position rests squarely on accountability. The textual structure across Genesis 3 and 4 demands that we prioritize moral jurisdiction. The Nahash is defined by its lack of accountability, and it serves to set the stage for the true beginning of sin and culpability, which rests on the shoulders of humanity, first shown by Cain. This honors the text's focus on human moral agency.
And my position rests on archetype. Respecting the text means honoring its typological continuity, which is established right there in the Pentateuch and affirmed all the way into the New Testament. The Nahash is a wisdom-bearing symbol placed above the standard sacrificial order and affirmed by Christ as the model for his own consequence-bearing role. And this perspective reveals Genesis 3 not merely as a tale of human law and failure, but as the enduring foundation of God's redemptive pattern.
We've presented two perspectives on the serpent's identity, one focusing on the establishment of moral structure, the other on redemptive symbolism. Both positions demand a departure from that traditional and, I think, simplistic reading of the serpent to Satan.
We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence and continue exploring the profound depth and complexity embedded in this foundational material.
Okay, let's just jump right in. For centuries, for basically the entire history of Western theology, the story of Genesis 3 has been built on one single massive assumption.
And that is?
That the serpent in the Garden of Eden is Satan, the devil, the ultimate cosmic bad guy who sneaks into paradise to ruin everything.
Right. It's the foundation for how we think about sin, temptation, judgment, pretty much everything.
But what if that foundation isn't actually in the text? What if it's just, centuries of tradition layered on top of the story?
That's exactly what the source material we're looking at today argues. It demands that we, and you listening, set aside what we think we know and look only at the original Hebrew, the narrative sequence, and the patterns that run through the entire Bible.
So our mission for this deep dive is to strip all that baggage away. We're going back to the source to explore two huge, frankly, paradigm-shifting claims.
The first is who the Nash, the Hebrew word for the serpent, is not. It is not Satan. And second, and this is the really wild part, who the Nash is.
Which is the first shadow, the first prophetic icon of the suffering Messiah, of Christ himself.
And we're going to get there by drilling down on the linguistic details. Things like why the phrase cursed above actually means an elevation, not a humiliation, and why Satan is a job description, a role that shows up much later.
We'll trace this unbroken redemptive line from the garden through this bizarre story about a bronze serpent on a pole in the wilderness, all the way up to Jesus' own words about the cross.
If we get this right, you're going to see a level of structural coherence restored to the biblical narrative that is just, well, it's breathtaking. It connects Genesis straight through to the Gospels.
It promises a series of aha moments that pivot the whole story away from a cosmic myth and back toward human responsibility. So let's start at the beginning. Let's deconstruct the villain.
The first mistake, the foundational error in the traditional reading, is that it assumes malice from the very first word.
Right. The serpent slithers onto the page and we're immediately told, this is the bad guy.
Exactly. But if you do a deep dive into Genesis 3, verse 1, in the Hebrew, that assumption it doesn't hold up. The language doesn't support it.
The text introduces the Nahash, the serpent, as being more arum than any beast of the field. And that word arum, that's the key, isn't it?
It is the absolute key, because almost every English translation you pick up will render arum as cunning, crafty, or sly.
And all those words in English have a negative connotation. They sound sneaky, deceptive.
Precisely. That is the interpretive tradition importing malice directly into the translation. But the textual reality of the word is much, much broader, and frankly, it's positive.
Positive how? What does it actually mean?
The core meaning is subtle, shrewd, perceptive, or prudent. This isn't the language of zoology, it's the vocabulary of discernment. It's pure okma, it's wisdom language.
So can you give us an example of where else we see this word used? Because if it means wise, that completely changes the feeling of the encounter in the garden.
Oh, absolutely. Just look at the book of Proverbs, which is basically the heart of Hebrew wisdom literature. Barum is used over and over again as a term of praise.
Really?
Yes. Proverbs 14.8 says, "The wisdom of the prudent Orim is to understand his way." Or Proverbs 12.16, "A prudent Orim man conceals shame." The prudent person is the one with foresight, with insight.
Wow. So the very first adjective used to describe the serpent is the same one used to describe a model sage in Proverbs.
It's a term of competence, not moral corruption. If the text wanted to say the serpent was wicked or evil, Hebrew has plenty of words for that. Rasha, Ra. But the author chose Orim.
The first signal isn't, here comes the villain. It's, here comes the wisdom bearer.
That's the shift. The encounter becomes a theological dialogue about discernment, not a simple confrontation with evil.
And the sources also point out something odd about its origin, its taxonomy. We just assume it's another animal, but the text treats it differently.
It does. Genesis 1 is so meticulous, it categorizes everything. Cattle, birds, creeping things, all after their kind. But the Nahash is never mentioned in that creation account. It has no genealogy.
So how is it introduced?
It's introduced by its location, at the tree of knowledge, the center of discernment, and by its function, its wisdom. This suggests it's a symbolic being, a wisdom agent, not just another snake.
And that would have made sense to the original audience, right, in the context of the ancient Near East.
Completely. In Egypt, in Sumeria, serpentine beings were powerful symbols of wisdom, knowledge, guardianship, often connected to sacred trees. The Egyptian uraeus, the cobra on the pharaoh's crown, guarded the tree of life. The Nahash stands in that symbolic tradition.
So to just see it as a pest in the dirt is to miss its entire structural and mythological weight.
You miss the whole point. It is fundamentally wisdom-coded from the start.
Okay, so even if we grant that the Nahash is wise, the traditional argument pivots to its actions. It says the wisdom was corrupted by malice, and the proof is the great lie. You will not surely die.
Yes, this is the core of the traditional reading. This is the supposed malicious deception that kicks off the fall.
And this is where I think a lot of people listening, people grounded in that tradition, are going to push back hard. How can "you will not surely die" be anything but a direct lie?
Because we have to look at the timeline and the tension in God's own commands. What was God's original instruction in Genesis 2.1 Sia?
In the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die.
Right, in the day. But did Adam and Eve drop dead that afternoon? No. Adam goes on to live for 930 years. Immediate physical death did not happen.
So what was the serpent doing?
It was engaging a paradox, a tension between two divine imperatives. The first was the mortality clause, eat and die. But what was the other command from Genesis 1?
Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth.
Exactly. Now, if they had died that very day, how could they fulfill the command to be fruitful and multiply? It would be structurally impossible. Ah, okay. So the serpent is highlighting the ambiguity. It's not saying you will never die. It's saying you will not surely die that day, because that would contradict God's other primary command for humanity.
Precisely. It's speaking with what the source material calls theological precision. It's a statement about the timing and the nature of death, not a flat-out denial of it. And then look at the other two things it said.
Your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil.
What does Genesis 3.7 say happened right after they ate? Then the eyes of both were opened, the serpent was right.
And the other part, about being like God.
Let's let God have the last word on that.
In Genesis 3.22, God himself says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil."
Wow, that's extraordinary. God's own testimony confirms that the serpent's statement was true.
So the serpent spoke a complex, ambiguous truth that forced a crisis. It didn't utter a simple, malicious falsehood. This fact alone makes it impossible to just label the Nahash as an evil liar. The text just doesn't support it.
So if the serpent is a wisdom agent speaking theological truth, it can't be Satan, who is the traditional father of lies. This brings us to the biggest claim from our sources, what the word Satan actually means.
Yes, we have to understand that Satan and devil throughout Scripture don't function as names for a species of being. They function as descriptors of a role, a function. They are predicates.
Okay, let's break that down. What's the difference between a predicate and, an ontological being?
Think of it like a job title. If I say the prosecutor, that's a predicate. It describes what a person does. They bring a case against someone.
Right.
If I say prosecutor Smith, Smith is the actual person, the ontological being who is currently filling the role of the prosecutor. The role itself can be filled by anyone.
So the Hebrew word Satan just means adversary or opposer. It's the job title, the adversary.
Exactly. In the book of Job, the figure who shows up is called Ha-Satan, the adversary. He has a specific function in God's court. He's not some independent evil king.
And the clearest example is in the Gospels, right? With Peter.
Yeah. The most striking example. Jesus turns to Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter is the person, the being. But in that moment, when he opposes Jesus' mission to go to the cross, he steps into the adversarial role. Peter doesn't literally turn into a demon.
He's just acting as the adversary in that moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so Satan is a function. How does the famous prophecy in Genesis 3.15 about enmity fit into this model?
This is crucial. God says, "I will put enmity, Oa, between you, the serpent, and the woman." Oa, enmity, is a relational condition. It's a state of opposition. It is the adversarial predicate.
And the key insight here is that God puts this enmity between the parties. It's not inside the serpent.
That is the whole point. The adversarial tension itself, the rupture in the relationship, is the satanic element. It's Ha-Satan. The Nahash is just the vehicle for articulating that this rupture now exists.
But someone listening might ask, if the serpent is the one that triggers this, isn't it still the first one to be culpable? Doesn't it become the first host of this adversarial role?
And that's where the traditional reading becomes, well, conceptually absurd if you stick to the Hebrew. If the serpent was Satan, the actual being, then God would be saying, "I am putting Satan between Satan and the woman."
A being can't be a condition between itself and someone else.
It makes no sense. The narrative is describing a condition of opposition ova, which is the functional definition of Ha-Satan. The Nahash itself is never warned, never commanded to rule over anything, and never judged as a moral agent who broke a rule.
So the creature is morally neutral. It's just the catalyst. And since it's never judged as the adversary, it cannot be Satan.
That's the conclusion. The serpent is assigned a role in the drama, but the adversarial predicate itself has to find an accountable host later on in the story.
Okay, let's pivot to that assigned role. If the serpent isn't Satan, how on earth do we reread the famous curse? Because traditionally that's seen as its moment of total humiliation.
And this section of the source material just flips that entire humiliation narrative on its head.
The traditional view is God demoted the serpent, made it lower than all other creatures, forced it to crawl in the dirt.
But the Hebrew says something very, very different. Let's focus on two details. The first is the phrase, "cursed above all livestock."
Above, not beneath.
The Hebrew preposition is mikol. It means more than, or set above, or distinguished from. We're talking about a unique separation, a selection. It's not cursed lower than, it's cursed distinct from.
And the second detail is the phrase, all livestock. That's not just a random category of animals, is it?
Not in a sacred cultic context like the Torah. Livestock refers specifically to the animals used in the temple for sacrifice. Bulls, goats, sheep, the animals of atonement.
Okay, so put those two together for us.
To be cursed above all livestock is not to be degraded into vermin. It is to be set apart for a unique redemptive purpose that is superior to the standard sacrificial system.
That is a staggering reinterpretation.
It's a cultic elevation, not a degradation. The curse here, arar, is a binding, an assignment. God is assigning the Nahash a unique redemptive vocation that stands above the normal system of animal sacrifice.
And that's essential because if it were just humiliation, the serpent would be useless for the rest of salvation history. But this way, It's set up for something more.
It establishes the pattern. The Nahash is set apart to bear consequence in a way that a lamb or a goat can't. This is the only way to make sense of what happens later in the book of Numbers.
Okay, let's get to the second part of that curse. Dust you shall eat. This is always pictured as a literal punishment, forcing it to eat dirt.
And again, we have to let Genesis define its own terms. What is dust in the book of Genesis?
It's what man is made from.
Genesis 2.7, God forms man from the dust. And what is the consequence of the fall in Genesis 3.19? For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Dust is the symbol of human mortality.
So when God tells the serpent, dust you shall eat, it's not a change in diet.
It's profound symbolic language. For the serpent to eat dust is for it to symbolically consume, bear, and carry the consequence of human mortality. The dust eater is the assigned bearer of human death.
Which is the exact role Christ fulfills on the cross. He became a curse for us. He became sin. The serpent is the prophetic sign bearer of the consequence of the fall.
Exactly. It's not about biology, it's about theology. The text prioritizes the symbolic function because that's the function that gets fulfilled later.
This brings us to the posture. On your gush you shall go. We usually hear that translated as belly.
The word gush refers to the lowest part of the body, the part that's in constant contact with the earth. It symbolizes humiliation, burden-bearing, a state of wandering. It is the lowest possible posture.
And how does that connect to the Messiah?
It's the perfect Christological fulfillment. Jesus walked his entire ministry on his symbolic gush. He had no place to lay his head. He was the wandering, humble burden bearer.
The ultimate earth walker.
And think about this detail. Just before his crucifixion, what does he do? He gets on his knees in the lowest posture and washes the dust, the symbol of mortality, from his disciples' feet. He is the true Goshen walker, cleansing us from the consequence he was assigned to bear.
So the entire curse is really an assignment. It's the script for a prophetic, messianic role. The humble bearer of human mortality.
It is liturgical symbolism from start to finish.
Okay, so we've established this incredible theological grammar in Genesis. But does the rest of the Bible confirm it? This brings us to Numbers 21. If the serpent was evil, why on earth would God use it as the very instrument of salvation in the wilderness?
This is the intertextual proof. It's the hinge. The Israelites are in the desert, they've sinned, they're complaining, and God sends fiery serpents as judgment. People are being bitten and they're dying.
And Moses intercedes. And what is God's command?
It's not sacrifice a lamb, it's not offer a bull, it's something utterly unique. He tells Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. The healing sign is the very thing that represents the judgment. Not a lamb, not a goat. The very creature tradition calls the source of evil is now the source of salvation from death.
And this is the undeniable logic that validates the Genesis 3 reading. A lamb or a goat, the standard sacrificial animals, couldn't heal Israel here. Only the Nahash could.
Why?
Because Genesis 3.14 had already placed it above the sacrificial animals. It had already consecrated it for a unique redemptive function that addresses the consequence of mortality, the dust directly. This event in Numbers confirms its sacred redemptive role.
It's not some random weird story. It's the systematic unfolding of the vocational pattern that was established back in Eden. God wouldn't lift up a symbol of pure evil to bring salvation.
Never. The object lifted up in the wilderness has to have the same spiritual DNA as the object assigned a role in the garden. The bronze serpent isn't a symbol of rebellion. It's a symbol of divine provision through a consequence bearer. But I have to ask the common counter question here. Later on, King Hezekiah destroys that very bronze serpent because people started worshiping it. Doesn't that prove it was ultimately an evil object?
That's a great question, and a necessary one. Hezekiah's action proves that God condemns the misuse of a divine instrument, not the instrument's original purpose.
So it's about idolatry.
Exactly. The cross itself can become an idol if you worship the wood instead of the one who hung on it. Hezekiah destroyed it because the people had elevated the symbol above the source of the healing, which was God himself. It proves the people were idolaters, not that the Nahash archetype was satanic.
The pattern is set in Genesis, it's confirmed in Numbers, and then centuries later, the ultimate fulfillment shows up. Jesus himself provides the final, explicit witness.
John 3.14, it's the typological capstone. Jesus is talking to Nicodemus and says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up."
The implication there is just massive. He doesn't say, as the lamb was slain, even though he is the lamb. He specifically chooses the Nahash model. the serpent on the pole, as the pattern for his elevation on the cross.
If the Genesis serpent were Satan, Jesus could not and would not identify the central act of salvation with it. By choosing the serpent, he is validating the entire redemptive archetype. The cross is the elevation of the consequence bearer.
So the serpent on the pole bore the venom, the consequence of sin, for the people. And Christ on the cross bears the dust, the mortality, for all people.
It's the highest form of suffering servant imagery. Christ's own claim here confirms, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the Nahash is a positive, redemptive archetype fulfilling the role assigned back in Genesis 3.
But this brings us to the one verse that traditional theology always throws down to end this conversation. Revelation 12.9. It explicitly calls that ancient serpent the devil and Satan. How do you square that with everything we've just said?
You square it by understanding literary genre. Revelation is not simple history, it's complex, symbolic, apocalyptic literature. John isn't writing a genealogy of the creature from Eden.
So what is he doing?
He's drawing on a whole library of Old Testament chaos motifs, Leviathan, sea monsters, dragons, and he's using serpent as symbolic shorthand for ultimate cosmic opposition.
So it's like when he calls Rome Babylon. He's using an old name as a symbol for a current reality. It's not a literal identification.
That's the key distinction. Apocalyptic literature often collapses different historical figures into a single symbolic image of opposition. If Revelation 12.9 was meant as a direct historical link back to the specific creature from Genesis 3, then you have a massive problem.
Which is?
Revelation would be calling Christ's own chosen pattern for the cross the devil, and that is theologically incoherent.
So the imagery in Revelation names the ultimate spirit of opposition, the Satan predicate, but it doesn't retroactively identify the neutral wisdom agent of Eden.
Exactly. The Nahash in Genesis was the vehicle of the rupture. The dragon in Revelation is the symbol of all post-rupture evil.
Okay, so we've established who the Nahash is not, and that its role is actually redemptive. But if the serpent is not Satan, where does evil, where does accountability actually enter the story? When does Satan, the adversarial role, finally get an actor?
This is where the narrative structure of the Bible is just so precise. We define Satan as a predicate, a role. So that role must be embodied by an accountable agent. And the Bible is crystal clear about when moral culpability begins.
And it's not in Genesis 3.
It's not in Genesis 3. Think back to what Jesus said in John 8.44, that the devil was a murderer from the beginning. We all just assume the beginning means the beginning of time.
But you're saying that's not what it means.
Well, let's just track the narrative. Where does the first murder happen? Not Genesis 3. It's in Genesis 4 with Cain. So the beginning here can't be the beginning of the cosmos.
So what beginning is it?
The beginning of moral jurisdiction. The beginning of covenant accountability. You can't be held guilty for breaking a rule you were never given.
Okay, so accountability requires a specific set of conditions. What are they?
The sources lay out 3 conditions that must be met for true culpability. First, instruction is given a clear standard. Second, a warning is explicitly addressed. Here's the consequence. And third, agency is affirmed. You are told you have the power and the command to rule over the negative force.
And none of those 3 things are ever said to the Nahash in Genesis 3.
Never. The serpent is assigned a role. It's never warned, never given a choice. That's why it's judged as a functional vehicle, not a moral transgressor. The danger isn't the wisdom agent. The danger is the human who is given those 3 conditions and refuses to act.
Which points us directly to Cain.
It points us to the decisive moment in Genesis 4.7. God speaks directly to Cain before the murder and warns him. Sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it.
Let's break that down. All 3 conditions are there.
They are perfectly met. 1, instruction God sets the standard, do what is right. 2, warning sin is crouching at the door. And 3, the command of agency. But you must rule over it.
Mastery is commanded. So when Cain refuses to rule, when he gives in and commits the murder,
he becomes the first accountable, culpable host of the adversarial predicate. The ova, the enmity, that was just a condition before, now finds its human vessel.
So Cain is, narratively, the first murderer, which fulfills John 8.44.
He's the first liar, am I my brother's keeper? And he is the first judged host of the satanic function.
That shifts the entire burden of responsibility from a mythical creature onto human failure. The problem isn't the snake, it's the person who refuses to rule when commanded.
And that's why the Nahash can't be Satan. The adversarial predicate is judged and embodied in Cain, not in the serpent. The narrative sequence makes it textually impossible.
That clarity on the sequence is it's so powerful. Okay, let's get into the really advanced synthesis here, the deep connections that tie all this together.
We're moving into some territory now that shows the incredible symmetry and pattern recognition in the text that binds the serpent and the Messiah.
Let's start with the numerical signature.
Right. To confirm this conceptual link, the source material points to something from the tradition of Hebrew gematria, where letters have numerical values. This isn't proof on its own, but it's a powerful echo.
And this is the part I find absolutely stunning. The symmetry. What are the numbers?
The Hebrew word for serpent, Nash Nun, Chet, Shin, has a numerical value of 358.
Okay, 358.
And the Hebrew word for Messiah, Mashiach Mem, Shin, Yod, Chet, has the exact same numerical value, 358.
Wow. That can't be an accident. If the Sapuric was the ultimate symbol of evil, you would never have the numerical signature of the Redeemer aligned with it.
Again, we don't build doctrine on numbers, but you can't ignore it. It's a powerful internal echo of the doctrine. It suggests that the Nasha and the Mashiach occupy the same conceptual space in the divine plan.
One is the shadow in the garden.
And the other is the fulfillment of that pattern. The symmetry confirms their functional relationship as sign and substance.
Okay, so that brings us to Genesis 3.15, the prophecy of the bruising, the one we all think we know. The traditional reading is Jesus crushes Satan's head. But this framework suggests a complete reversal.
A radical reversal. First, we have to understand that seed of the woman, Zerah, is a collective noun. It means offspring, lineage. It's humanity.
So the conflict isn't Jesus versus Satan. It's humanity versus the Nash Christ archetype.
Exactly. So let's reread the prophecy with that in mind. He, humanity, shall bruise the Nosh's head, and you, the Nosha, shall bruise his humanity's heel.
Okay, let's take the first part. Humanity bruises the Nash's head. How is that fulfilled?
Explicitly at the crucifixion. The place of the crucifixion is Golgotha, the hill of the skull, the symbolic head. Jesus, the Nash Christ, is the one who is crushed. He is bruised for our transgressions. Humanity, acting in the line of Cain, is the agent of violence that crushes the head of wisdom.
So wait, we humanity are the aggressors. The traditional reading makes Jesus the aggressor, crushing evil. This reading says humanity is the aggressor, crushing the redemptive figure.
That is the profound reversal. We are the ones administering the violence at Golgotha, and Jesus, the Nash type, bears it.
Now the second part. The Nashas bruises humanity's heel. What does that mean?
The heel represents the foundation, the dominion, the way human systems walk and stand. When the Nash Christ is crushed, his work destabilizes the foundation of the human project that's built on violence and death. His resurrection shatters the presumptions of human empire.
So humanity delivers a fatal-looking blow to the head, but the consequence bearer's work delivers a destabilizing blow to humanity's foundation. It makes perfect sense.
And it reinforces the detail that Jesus carried our cross, the instrument of our judgment. He fulfilled the Nasha's role as the one who eats the dust of our mortality.
This also forces us to rethink the idea that seed of the woman is exclusively about Mary's biological connection to Jesus.
It does. The immediate context is Eve and her children. She immediately points to Cain. And the New Testament itself suggests Christ's body was divinely prepared, not just genetically derived from a human lineage.
So what is Jesus' ultimate identity here, if not the biological seed of the woman?
Vocationally, Jesus is the ultimate seed of the Nash, not by biology, but by function. He is wisdom embodied. He is the consequence bearer who eats the dust, and he is the one lifted up for healing.
The cross isn't the defeat of the serpent pattern. It's the glorious completion of it.
The entire arc, from the garden to Numbers to John 3.1 Sean to the numerical symmetry, it becomes one unified, coherent, redemptive pattern. The serpent was never the enemy. It was the first prophetic icon of the Redeemer.
That structural coherence is just. It's breathtaking. It really forces you to stop seeing Genesis as a simple mythic battle and start seeing it as a precise theological drama about wisdom, consequence, and our accountability.
So to summarize this whole deep dive for you, the learner, there are really three key takeaways that should fundamentally change how you read the Bible.
First, Satan is a functional role, the adversarial condition, that finds its first truly accountable embodiment in Cain's human refusal, not in the serpent in the garden.
Second, the curse in Genesis 3 is actually an elevation, an assignment above the standard sacrificial system, a role confirmed by the bronze serpent being used for healing in Numbers 21.
And third, Jesus himself claimed the Nash as the pattern for his crucifixion in John 3.19, validating its role as the prophetic shadow of the cross, the one whose head we bruised.
This reading moves the focus away from blaming some external cosmic villain and puts it squarely back on internal moral responsibility.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to take with you. If the serpent of Genesis is truly the first shadow of the cross, the symbolic bearer of our consequence, what does that mean for how we face adversity in our own lives?
Does this framework shift the focus from blaming a devil for our failures to taking radical personal responsibility, recognizing that the only real judged danger is a human who refuses to rule over that adversarial condition when commanded?
The true battle was never against a snake in the dirt. It was, and is, against the refusal to choose rightly in the face of accountability. A choice God commanded us, in the person of Cain, to master from the very beginning.
All right, let's take one of the most foundational stories you think you know and just turn it completely on its head. We're going to re-examine the serpent in the Garden of Eden, but not through centuries of tradition, oh no. We're going straight to the original language of the text. And let me tell you, what we find there might just change how you see, well, everything. Think about it. For literally thousands of years, this character has been the poster child for evil, the tempter, the deceiver, the one who kicked off sin and death for all of us. It's an assumption so deep in our culture, we don't even think to question it. It just is. But what if that core assumption, the one everything else is built on, is just wrong? What if the original text is telling a radically different story? A story where the serpent isn't the bad guy, but maybe, just maybe, the first shadowy prototype of redemption itself. Now, to see this, we first have to really acknowledge the story we've all inherited, right? The traditional view is super clear, super simple. The serpent is Satan in a snake suit. He's the source of evil who orchestrated the fall of man. And look, this has been the dominant interpretation for centuries. And here is where that traditional story starts to get some serious cracks. Just look at the gap between what we think it says and what's actually on the page. All those words we automatically connect with the serpent, Satan, evil, liar, deceiver, they're just not there. They are completely absent from Genesis chapter 3. So where did we even get that idea? And, more importantly, what does the text actually say? Well, the answers are buried in the original Hebrew. And when we brush off the dust of our translations and our inherited ideas, we start to find these incredible clues. Clues that are embedded in the very fabric of the language that challenge everything we thought we knew. And the first major clue, the first domino to fall, is right there in the serpent's introduction. The text doesn't call it evil or wicked or malicious. Nope. It uses a very specific and frankly a very different Hebrew word, arum. So what does arum mean? Well, it definitely doesn't mean evil. It means wise, shrewd, perceptive. Elsewhere in the Bible, like in the book of Proverbs, it's actually used to praise someone who is prudent and thoughtful. So right from the very first verse, the text is framing the serpent not as a figure of moral wickedness, but as a figure of wisdom. And that's just the first clue. We're just getting started. Now we're going to unlock 3 more critical Hebrew words from the so-called curse that completely, and I mean completely, reframe the serpent's role in this whole story. First up, mikol. Now, when God says the serpent is cursed above all livestock, we always read that as a punishment, right? A demotion. But the word mikol actually means more than or elevated above. And get this, in the ancient world, livestock were the animals used for sacrifice. So this isn't a demotion, it's an elevation. The serpent is being set apart, placed in a special category above the entire sacrificial system. Okay, second word, apar, or dust. The serpent is told it will eat dust. Sounds pretty gross, right? Like a terrible punishment? But here's the thing. The Bible defines its own symbols. Just a few verses later, God tells Adam, "For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." See, dust isn't a diet. It's a powerful symbol for human mortality. So for the serpent to eat dust, well, that means it's symbolically taking on or bearing the consequence of humanity's new mortality. And third, aiva, which means enmity. This is the word people often point to as proof of the serpent's evil. But look closely at how it's used. God places aiva between the different parties. Enmity is introduced as a condition of opposition, not as the serpent itself. The Hebrew word for an adversary, by the way, is Satan. So what the text is saying is that the satanic condition is entering the world, but it never, ever equates that condition with the serpent. So let's recap. The original language seems to reframe the serpent as this wisdom-bearing symbol that's elevated to bear the consequence of mortality. It's a pretty strange idea, I'll admit. But the crucial question is, does this weird pattern show up anywhere else? And the answer is a resounding yes in one of the most shocking prophetic arcs in the entire Bible. Just follow the trail here. In Genesis 3, the serpent is elevated and appointed to this unique symbolic role. Fast forward centuries later to the book of Numbers. The Israelites are in the desert, they're dying from venomous snake bites. And what is God's bizarre solution? He tells Moses to make a bronze serpent and lift it up on a pole so that anyone who looks at it will live. Whoa. The very symbol from the garden now becomes the divine instrument of healing. And this brings us to the final, absolutely stunning step. Because in the Gospel of John, Jesus Christ himself makes the connection crystal clear. He directly compares his own crucifixion, the ultimate act of salvation, to Moses lifting up that serpent in the wilderness. So this forces us to ask a huge, unavoidable question. If the serpent is really the embodiment of Satan, a symbol of pure evil, then why on earth would Jesus use it as a direct parallel for his own redemptive death? I mean, think about it. The traditional interpretation just can't answer that. It creates this massive, glaring contradiction right at the heart of the entire story. But if we just follow the textual evidence that we've been uncovering, that contradiction completely vanishes, and a new, perfectly consistent framework emerges. One that positions the serpent not as the villain, but as the very first shadow of Christ. So let's just lay out this new picture. The serpent isn't Satan. It's a symbol of wisdom. It isn't demoted. It's elevated into a special, almost sacrificial role. It bears the consequence of our mortality, becomes the very sign of healing when it's lifted up, and finds its ultimate fulfillment in the crucifixion of Christ. And if all of that wasn't already stunning enough, the ancient Hebrew text has one last mind-blowing secret encoded within it. It's a literary device called gematria, where letters also have numerical values. This allowed ancient authors to create these hidden layers of meaning right there in the text. And here it is, the unbelievable payoff. The Hebrew word for serpent, Nahash, has a numerical value of 358, and the Hebrew word for Messiah, Mashiach, also has the exact same numerical value, 358. That is not a coincidence, folks. That is a deliberate theological link, a numerical signature hidden in the text itself, connecting these two figures across the ages. So here's the bottom line. From its language, to its narrative arc, to its very numerical structure, the text itself is practically shouting that the serpent was never the enemy. It was the first sign of redemption, the first shadow of the one who would be lifted up to bring life to the world. Which, of course, leaves us with one last provocative thought to chew on. If the serpent wasn't the villain all along, then maybe we've been looking for the source of evil in the completely wrong place. And maybe the true adversary was never some creature in a garden, but that condition of enmity, that opposition to God that was introduced that day into the human heart.